Okay. All right, we're talking about different descriptions of Jesus right now. Paul is starting to close out this section on descriptions of Jesus. Talking about Jesus, Colossians 1 and verse 15, Paul writes, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation." So Paul has spent a little time talking about how we have redemption in Christ, and now he's circled back to the idea of different descriptions about Jesus. And now he's saying that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. You know, John, the apostle, is emphatic that nobody has ever seen God the Father. In 1 John 4 and verse 12, John says very explicitly, "No one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love has been perfected in us." Similarly, in John 1 and verse 18, as he's beginning his gospel account, he writes, "No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him." Other writers would also mention God the Father's invisibility. And in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 16, Paul writes, "Christ alone has immortality, dwelling in unapproachable light." That is to say, he is dwelling with the Father, whom no man has seen or can see, to whom be honor and everlasting power. Amen. Similarly, the Hebrews writer writes in Hebrews 11:27, "By faith Moses forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." Seeing him who is invisible. All right, I want to go and open our Bibles to this one in particular so that we can see it with our own eyes. Let's open our Bibles to Exodus 33. Exodus chapter 33, and we're going to see how God himself describes his invisibility. Exodus 33, beginning in verse 20 here. "The Father himself said to Moses, 'You cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live.' Therefore, because his face could not be shown, the Father chose to let Moses hide in the cleft of the rock and let Moses see his backside." Exodus 33, beginning in verse 21. "The Lord said, 'Here's a place by me, and ye shall stand on the rock. So it shall be, while my glory passes by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand while I pass by. Then I will take away my hand, and ye shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen.'" And just after seeing God's backside, Moses' face began to shine. That was to show that, among other reasons, God was very serious about what he had said. Last couple verses we'll read. Chapter 34, beginning in verse 29. "Now it was so, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in Moses' hand." 34:29. "He came down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone while he talked with him. So when Aaron and all the children of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. Then Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the rulers of the congregation returned to him. And Moses talked with them. Afterward all the children of Israel came near and gave them as commandments all the Lord has spoken with him on Mount Sinai. And when Moses had finished speaking with him, he put a veil on his face. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take the veil off until he came out, and he would come out and speak to the children of Israel whatever he had commanded. And whatever the children of Israel saw the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face shone, then Moses would put the veil on his face again until he would go and speak with him again." So, in other words, just seeing God's backside made Moses' face to shine. Right? So, God is not invisible in the way that we think about invisibility, as in, like you can see through him. Right? God is invisible in the sense that if you were to look at him, you would die. So, I don't know the ins and outs of that, I know what John said about us one day seeing God. He said, there will come a day whenever we can see God as he is, for we will be like him. Right? So there will come a day in which we can see the Father in his glory, the glory that he chooses to show himself in. But until then, can't see the Father. Can't see the Father. Any thoughts or questions or comments on that?
Well, heaven is just a different, I don't want to call it realm, but heaven
Yeah.
is a different place. And even Jesus, when he came to earth, he took the form of a
Yes, that's right.
so it's unexplainable.
Right.
We won't know till we get there.
That's true. Yeah. We can't even picture in our minds. We can't even picture in our minds what we'll look like, let alone what God actually looks like. And so it's impossible. That being said, talking about Jesus, right? Jesus did come and he dwelt among us, is what John says, John 1 and verse 14. And so Jesus was God in the flesh. But there were other times in which God appeared not in the flesh, right? So, for example, probably most famous, he appeared as the burning fiery bush there in Exodus, what was it, Exodus 3 or 4? I know for sure 4. I think he showed up in chapter 3 as well. That's called a theophany. Theophany. That's whenever God took on a form that was not his true form in order to appear to men. That's probably what's going on here in Mount Sinai whenever Moses is allowed to see God's backside. But in any case, God is invisible. We cannot physically look upon him. Otherwise, there would be not good things for us. So, any other thoughts or questions or comments? All right, here's a question. How can Jesus be the image of an invisible God? How can a mirror reflect something that is invisible? How can you see visibly something that is invisible? Right? Jesus is the very image of the invisible God. So there's a little bit of it's not a contradiction, but it's a contrast here. Right? You can see Jesus, and Jesus is appearing as something that you can't see. Right? So let's think about that for a little bit. Yeah, that's how you see him. We walk by faith, not by sight. That's right. 2 Corinthians 5:7. But people actually did see Jesus.
He also said that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
That's right. That's right. They're in about John 14. Yeah. Jesus is the very image of God. That much is clear. Hebrews chapter 1, beginning in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. God, who at various times and various ways spoken time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his own Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom he also created the world, who is the express image of his person and the brightness of his glory, and other stuff in there too that is not coming to my mind. Jesus is emphatically the express image of God. He's the brightness of his glory. He is we might say a spitting image of the Father. Right? But not in a physical sense. Yes. That's right. That's right. Even we are to a degree the image of the Father, right? In Genesis 1:27, I will make man in our image. Let's make man in our image after our likeness. Okay, so does God look like me or does God look like you? Yeah, he looks like he doesn't look like any of us physically speaking, right? That's probably a good thing. What does that mean whenever it says that we are made in God's image? Well, right after describing that we are made in God's image, the one thing that distinguishes us from everything else in creation is that God breathed into man and he became a living being. He became a living soul. Right? We have an immortal component to our being. We have souls that are going to live into eternity, whether heaven or hell. They're going to live into eternity, right? And that way, we are made in the image of God. And that way, we resemble God, because guess what? God is also going to be there in eternity. He has already been in eternity. He is currently in eternity. Similarly, Jesus is not physically appearing like the Father. Jesus is sharing those characteristics with the Father. Okay, so here's another question. Why can we see Jesus, but we can't see the Father? And we've already danced around this one a bit. Why can we see Jesus, but we can't see the Father? Do you think it's because Jesus has less glory than the Father? Careful how you answer that. Yeah. It's not because it has nothing to do with glory, right? You know, God spoke to Moses and he says, you can't see my glory. But glory is out of the equation when it comes to us being able to see Jesus and not being able to see the Father. Philippians 2, beginning in verse 6, Paul wrote about Christ, who, being in the form of God, did not consider robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and came in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even to the death. We'll talk here in a second, Jesus clothing himself with flesh, but Jesus did not find being equal to God something to hold on to. He did not find being equal with God something to keep a hold of. Right? He did not get rid of his godhood status. However, he lowered himself. I use that word very carefully. He lowered himself and clothed himself with flesh. John 1 and verse 14, John writes, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." So it's talking about Jesus there. Jesus is the only begotten of the Father. Jesus is the Word. And John uses a very specific word there whenever he's describing what Jesus did. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, John 1:14. That word dwelt in John 1:14. Anybody know what that word means? It literally means tented, camped, tabernacled. Right? That's what a tabernacle is. It's a tent. Right? This is a common illustration for flesh in the New Testament. It occurs here in John 1:14. It occurs in 2 Corinthians 5. And I believe it occurs in 2 Peter a few different times. In all instances, they describe flesh as being something that's like a tent. All right, let's open our Bibles to 2 Corinthians 5 just to see a really clear example. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we're going to begin in verse 1 here. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 1, Paul writes, "For we know that of our earthly house, this tent," right, same word as dwelt in John 1:14, "this tent is destroyed. We have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven, if indeed having been clothed we shall not be found naked." Right, so he's using two different illustrations here to describe the same thing. Not only is your physical body a tent or house, but it's also a clothing. Your soul is clothed with flesh, so to speak. Verse 4, "For we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up in life." Right? He's talking about this new spiritual body which we'll receive, and he likens it to a tent. Right now we're in this very temporary body. We're in this very temporary tent, and one of these days, our soul is going to find a new tent to inhabit, a new spiritual body to inhabit. Right? That's the general idea of our new spiritual body. We're going to receive that new spiritual body in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, as Paul would describe it there in 1 Corinthians 15, or 1 Thessalonians 4. Anyway, he describes it somewhere. Jesus, like us, tented, right? Here's how I picture it. You've got, what sleeps inside a tent? A camper, right? Not like an RV, but like someone who's camping. A camper tents inside a tent, right? Your soul is like a camper, and your tent is your physical body, right? Jesus doesn't have a soul like you and I do, right? His soul is God. He is God. God is clothed in flesh. God is there in that tent, in that flesh, whenever we behold Jesus. There's a verse, I believe it's in Colossians. I don't have it here in my notes. But in the New King James it says, for in him dwells all the Godhead bodily. Someone can look that up, see where it's exactly at. I don't like the use of the word Godhead there. In fact, ironically, the 3 times that the word Godhead is found in the King James Bible, I don't like any of those translations. Not that the Godhead is a incorrect understanding of the Holy Trinity. I think it very much is a correct understanding, but the word Godhead is I don't think a good translation in any of those 3 instances. Instead, I think divinity is a better translation. That is the essence of God, the power of God. In him dwelt all of the essence of God bodily. Anybody find it? Everyone found it. Colossians 2:9, yeah. And does it say exactly that? In him dwells all the Godhead bodily? Yeah. Divinity, the power of God, the essence of God. In Jesus dwells all the essence of God bodily, in flesh. Right? It's not that he has any less glory than the Father. It's that he has lowered himself. Again, I use that word very carefully. He lowered himself to become visible to us. Right? The reason I use that word lowered is you remember David in Psalm 8, when I look to the heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him? But you have made him a little lower than the angels. Right? The Hebrews writer is going to use that same verse in Psalm 8 and apply it to Jesus. Jesus was made a little lower than the angels, right? He took on temporarily that status that was a little lower than the angels. He's higher than the angels, obviously, in prestige, but physically he's a little lower than the angels whenever he's clothed in flesh. So anyway, so Jesus is the express image of the Father. He is exactly what God looks like on the inside. But on the outside, physically, he's a little different than the Father. The Father doesn't have flesh and blood like you and I do, like Jesus did. So, any thoughts or questions on that? You've never thought that deeply about Jesus being clothed in flesh before, have you?
What about, I looked up in Joshua.
Uh-huh.
When it was kind of the same as Moses with the burning bush
Uh-huh.
with Joshua.
Oh, there. Yeah. That would have been a theophany as well, right? There at the beginning of Joshua 6, verse 1, when he and Joshua are overlooking Jericho, and he says, "See, I've given into your hand Jericho." That part. Are you in Joshua 5?
It's 5.
Yeah.
5.
Yeah, and then it starts.
The man stood over against him with
Yeah.
the sword drawn in his hand.
Yeah. So that would have been the technical term is a theophany as well, and most often it's thought that whenever you have a bodily form of God, that it's not the Father, instead it's Jesus, right? So the most famous example of that is going to be whenever Abraham and God, Jehovah, that's the word used there in Genesis 18. They're having this conversation over whether or not Sodom and Gomorrah should be spared for 50 people, 40 people, so on and so forth. That's Jesus for sure, because Jesus said that Abraham was glad to see his day. So at some point, Abraham saw Jesus, and Jesus is Jehovah. Therefore, that must have been Jesus there, right?
And what about who Jacob wrestled with?
Yep, that would have been another one. Yep, where I have seen God and lived, and the one who, yep. Another one that's fairly well known, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then there was a fourth one in the fire. The Son of Man is how it's described, and that's assumed to be Jesus. There's probably the broadest that you can get with finding Jesus in the Old Testament in a theophany form is I believe it's there.
The donkey?
Yeah, that would have been, but I believe it's there whenever Jacob and God is wrestling with each other, and that one who's wrestling with Jacob is described as the angel of the Lord, and then is later described as Jehovah Lord, right? And so some people think that every reference to the angel of the Lord is a reference to Jesus, and so that would have included Balaam's donkey there. That's the angel of the Lord. That would have also included the destroyer at the end of 2 Samuel, whenever David takes the unlawful census, and then the angel of the Lord goes and wipes out X% of the population, right? That would have also included whenever the angel of the Lord smote the 185,000 Assyrians. They're in 1 Kings 18. Anyway, so there's a lot of references. I don't personally think that the angel of the Lord is always Jesus, just because of context. But he's definitely sometimes Jesus.
He was there for Joshua, but
Yeah.
he let him worship him.
Yeah,
He remove his sandals.
that's right. I forgot about it. Yep.
Just like with Moses.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And angels, if they were true angels, would not allow that, right? Satan, who's a fallen angel, wanted that, right? Fall down and worship me, he said to Jesus, Matthew 4. You know, but faithful angels would not permit that. So, yep. Yeah. The technical term is theophany. Anytime that Jesus appears, not in flesh the way that he appeared there in whenever he was born, and then past that, whenever he lived on earth as Jesus. On that, I don't know how relevant it is. We'll include it just because we're kind of on it right now. Has anybody ever heard of Doceticism before? Okay, has anybody ever heard of Gnosticism before? We've heard of that one, yeah. Doceticism is a form of Gnosticism. It's under that umbrella. There are a few different things under the Gnosticism umbrella: Doceticism, asceticism, mysticism. Anything that has schism in it basically falls under that umbrella. Doceticism was the idea that Jesus did not come in the flesh, because flesh is evil and spirit is the only thing that's pure, and therefore Jesus could not have come into the flesh. You've heard of the Immaculate Conception. Do you know who that's talking about? The Immaculate Conception? It's not talking about Jesus. It's talking about Mary, right? So the Catholics had this problem where babies are born evil because they inherit their parents' sin. Well, Jesus has to be sinless, right? Therefore, he's got to be born of a sinless woman. Well, if she was, in order for Mary to be sinless, guess what? She must have been born sinless too. And so then she was miraculously conceived, and then later miraculously conceived Jesus as well. But you run into the same problem with Mary as you run. Anyway, the idea is that flesh is evil, that sin is passed on through the flesh. And it was a big doctrine there at the end of the first century. And John is going to write about that both in his gospel account and in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, especially 1st John. You remember the reference to Thomas? Why is Thomas famous? Yeah, doubting Thomas. And how did he become undoubting? Yeah, reach your hand, put it in my hand, touch my scar, touch my side. John is the only one who includes that, because John is writing at a time that doceticism has become very popular, and so he adds this detail that makes it emphatic that Jesus was in the flesh. By the way, John also includes details of Jesus eating and drinking after his resurrection in order to show that Jesus was flesh and blood even after the resurrection. Anyway, I don't know how relevant that is, but it becomes a big deal whenever you start to study other books. Taking a step back, Jesus is in flesh. Jesus has all of God in him. Therefore, Jesus is the very image of the invisible God, though he is visible. Any other thoughts or questions or comments on that? All right. Last thing on verse 15 here. Jesus is described as the firstborn of creation. I wrote these notes, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago, before James preached that 5th Sunday. That pseudo 5th Sunday, because it wasn't actually the 5th Sunday, it was the 3rd Sunday. Anyway, James brought up, I think it was in his Bible class, but it could have been his AM worship service, his AM sermon. James brought up that God once told David that David would be his firstborn. Psalm 89 and verse 27, God says about David, also I will make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. Anyway, I found that very interesting. It's well established that when God said that he made Jesus firstborn, that he made David firstborn, that he is not talking about actually creating him. Who was the first man created? Adam, not David, right? And yet David's the firstborn. Okay, so we're not talking about birth order here. We're talking about prestige. We're talking about status, right? David was given firstborn status, firstborn prestige. Later, Jesus is given that same prestige, but on a higher level. He's the firstborn of all creation, right? Not that he's created, but that he outranks everything in creation. Why? Because he created everything. So, okay, any thoughts or questions or comments on verse 15? I got one more thing under verse 15 on the firstborn of creation. Let's all open our Bibles to Isaiah 9:6. Isaiah 9:6. You're going to hear this one a lot here in the next couple of weeks because it's Christmas time and the world is remembering Jesus' birth right now. And this one talks about Jesus' birth. Not that I think that we need to, especially remember Jesus' birth right now at Christmas time, but the world is. Anyway, Isaiah 9 and verse 6. Isaiah writes, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Now that's very interesting. We're talking about Jesus here, right? Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And what's the title given to Jesus here that stands out, that's kind of odd? Everlasting Father. Is Jesus the Father? No. But he is a Father. Who is he the Father of? Yeah, he's the yeah. That's a not quite. He's technically the Father of everything because he created everything. This is again talking about status and not about birth, right? Jesus created everything. John 1 verses 1 and 2. in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and in him he created all things, and in him. Oh, someone quote it. Can someone quote John 1:2? I'm blanking on it. Well, now we got to go read it. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. I'm blanking on it. Yeah. He was in the beginning with God. That's what was causing me to stumble. That's verse 2. Verse 3, all things were made through him, and without him was not made anything made that was made. Yeah, you had it. You get the gold sticker tonight. Jesus created everything, and not anything that was, and everything that was made by him, right? And so in that sense, he is the symbolic father of creation, right? Just as he is the symbolic father of creation, he is also the symbolic firstborn of creation in status, right? So he's not both physically simultaneously, he's both figuratively, right? Anyway, we emphasize that he was not actually born in a, there at creation. He was born, obviously, but he pre-existed his birth. We emphasize that he had no beginning because there is one denomination especially who teaches that he was created, that he was the first created thing, first created being. Anybody know what that denomination is that's famous for teaching that? Jehovah's Witness. That's right. Yep. So. Okay, we've got 3 minutes left. Any thoughts, questions, or comments on verse 15? I did not mean to stay in verse 15 all this evening, but that's how the cookie crumbles sometimes. Maybe we can finish verse 16 and 17 real fast. You want to fly through those? Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. Any thoughts, questions, or comments? Well, let's read verse 16, just kind of to close out the thought. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones, dominions, principalities, or powers. All things were created through him and for him. Paul elaborates right then and there why he is considered the firstborn of creation. It's because he created all things, everything, and he lists several different things within Jesus' resume of what he's created. So, all right. Any final thoughts, questions, or comments before I let you out 2 minutes early? 1 minute and 15 seconds early? All right. We'll stand dismissed till next week.